Kalorama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint, presents Nationalized Politics, Evaluating Electoral Politics Across Time, by Jamie L. Carson, Joel Sievert, and Ryan D. Williamson. Read by Patrick Lawlor. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and ebook editions of the book. 1. Introduction. During the past few decades, elections in the United States have become more focused on national politics at the expense of local or contest-specific issues. One of the first attempts at nationalizing elections came in 1994, when Newt Gingrich, Republican, Georgia, sought to actively recruit experienced Republican challengers across the country to compete in as many congressional races as possible to maximize the Republicans' chances of winning back control of the House. In conjunction with running on their proposed Contract with America that fall, Republican candidates sought to capitalize on the growing unpopularity of incumbent President Bill Clinton, who made several missteps during his first 2 years in office. Indeed, Republican strategists opted to run campaign ads attacking some of the most vulnerable Democratic incumbents in the fall election by trying to link the Democrats explicitly to President Clinton. What was unique about these ads was the use of new computer technology that allowed them to digitally morph the images of individual incumbents into the face of Clinton, whose overall approval had dipped below 40% on multiple occasions. The Republicans' new campaign strategy was first employed in a May 1994 special election held in Kentucky to fill a vacancy created after Democratic incumbent William Natcher, who had represented the 2nd District since 1953, died in March of that year. Ron Lewis, a former college professor and Baptist minister, emerged to challenge Natcher. Many viewed him initially as a sacrificial lamb, since Democrats had previously controlled the seat since 1865. After Natcher's death, however, Republicans threw their support behind Lewis in the special election against Democratic nominee Joe Prather, a former Kentucky state legislator who sought to win on his own without assistance from the Democratic Party. In a series of ads prior to the special election, Republicans featured the face of Prather morphing into the face of Clinton, with a voiceover stating, "If you like Bill Clinton, you'll love Joe Prather. Kentucky doesn't need another professional politician." Lewis ended up finishing with 55% of the vote compared to 45% for Prather. The triumph of the national over local politics in American elections did not abate as the nation entered the start of a new century. During the 2016 elections, every state won by Hillary Clinton elected a Democratic senator, while every state won by Donald Trump elected a senator from the Republican Party. The strong correspondence between the presidential and senatorial contests led pundits to declare the 2016 Senate elections the most nationalized ever. In the 2018 Senate and gubernatorial elections, the trend continued, as political observers noted that most voters are casting straight-ticket ballots. The 2020 elections continued this trend, as every state except Maine supported co-partisan Senate and presidential candidates. Despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of states do not provide a straight-ticket voting option on the ballot, most voters consistently offer support for only one party's candidates, even without the president on the ballot. These high levels of partisan loyalty are similar to that witnessed by voters casting party ballots during most of the 19th century, when voters often had little or no choice but to cast a straight-ticket vote, as a result of the party ballot that was in use at the time. The greater focus on national political issues is not limited to congressional or gubernatorial elections, however. During the early 2010s, state legislators regularly campaigned for re-election by expressing either their support for or opposition to the Affordable Care Act, often simply referred to as Obamacare by Republicans, the health care reform legislation passed during President Barack Obama's first term. Although most state legislatures did not have jurisdiction over many of the issues that fell under the purview of the national health care legislation, that did not stop state legislative candidates from taking strong stances either in favor of or against this legislation during the campaign season. Indeed, many states introduced legislation that aimed to either prop up or cripple various aspects of the health care bill. One of the main reasons state legislators engaged in this behavior is that they recognized the utility in exploiting a highly nationalized and controversial policy that would resonate with their voters on Election Day based on their expressed support, or more often, opposition. In recent years, election scholars have studied these developments under the framework of election nationalization. By nationalization, we are referring to a phenomenon in which top-down forces, such as presidential vote choice or partisanship, inform voters' decisions in subnational elections rather than candidate-specific factors or local forces. In other words, voters have increasingly become less likely to take local or regional factors into account when choosing between different candidates on the ballot, and instead base their decisions about who to vote for or engage in political discussions on a broader range of considerations. For instance, voters may select local or statewide candidates based on specific national policies, for example, the Affordable Care Act or the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, or who is currently occupying the White House. More specifically, our definition of nationalization aligns closely with that of Hopkins. National and local politics are fought over related dimensions. As a consequence, national political divisions infuse subnational politics, and political engagement is primarily national in orientation. While there are certainly alternative ways to define nationalization, our definition is consistent with other recent studies on nationalization in congressional elections. A key feature that sets our study apart, however, is that we explore the relationship between nationalization and politics across a wider swath of history. Most of the recent work on nationalization, for instance, explores this phenomenon largely in the context of elections held during the past few decades. On one hand, this makes a lot of sense, as the increased nationalization observed in recent decades reflects a pattern that is fundamentally different from the conventional wisdom that all politics is local. Nevertheless, we believe it is important to consider a longer time period when studying nationalized elections, as we and other congressional elections scholars define them, since they are not a new phenomenon. Elections during the mid to late 19th century, for instance, were widely acknowledged to be more partisan than nationalized affairs. Indeed, the candidate at the top of the ticket was generally perceived to influence down-ballot races, since voters were not allowed to pick and choose among various offices when voting, as is the case today. The extent of nationalization has now reached levels unseen since the 19th century, when the party ballot was in use and voters were generally unable to select among individual candidates. There are, of course, important differences between the electoral politics of the 19th century and today. During the 19th century, the strong linkage between presidential and subnational voting, which is a common measure for defining nationalization, was a result of electoral institutions like the party ballot in use during this period, which forced voters to select among parties rather than candidates for office. With the adoption of progressive reforms such as the Australian ballot and the direct primary, elections became far less nationalized throughout the first half of the 20th century, which allowed for an increased role for incumbency and local influences, as well as more candidate-centered elections. The resurgence of nationalization during the past few decades, however, is not typically viewed as a function of institutional arrangements, as was once the case, but is attributed to decisions made by and attitudes among individual voters. These explanatory differences aside, the return of nationalized electoral contests provides a unique opportunity to analyze changes in elections across nearly 2 centuries of American electoral history. By examining 180 years of elections, our study leverages considerable differences in electoral competition, electoral rules, nationalization, polarization, and partisan advantage via the incumbency advantage. The purpose of this book, then, is to ask and answer the question, how has nationalization influenced elections across different political eras? That is the overriding goal of this book. Although we are beginning to see the effects of greater nationalization, we still do not have a firm grasp of the factors that may be contributing to nationalization in the modern era, nor do we fully understand its consequences. Are the factors similar to institutional factors that led to more nationalized elections during the past? Or are they a function of behavioral differences stemming from political elites or voters? Is it possible for nationalization to have distinct causes in different eras but similar political effects? When and under what conditions are the factors contributing to nationalization likely to recede? And what lessons can we draw upon from the past in addressing these issues? These are the types of questions that we seek to systematically explore in the sections that follow. Why study nationalization? As we indicated, politics were highly nationalized during much of the 19th century because of the party ballot in use at the time. When voters went to the polls on Election Day, they had little choice but to vote a single-party ticket, since voting was often done out in the open, and any attempts to split one's ticket were met with suspicion or distrust on the part of party officials who often monitored voters' behavior. Although there were certainly exceptions, much of electoral politics during this period was driven by the candidates at the top of the ticket. Accordingly, a popular presidential candidate could yield substantial gains for candidates of his party who would ride his coattails into office. At the same time, a candidate with significant political baggage could spell disaster during a presidential election or in a midterm. Following the adoption of the Australian ballot and direct primaries during the Progressive era, politics became much less nationalized over the ensuing decades. Voters could now regularly split their tickets, and candidates further down the ballot no longer had their electoral fortunes as closely tied to the individuals at the top of the ticket. This was the case for several decades, and elections eventually became more candidate-centered as a result. The rise of more candidate-focused electoral politics led to a rise in incumbent re-election rates starting in the 1960s, as well as a dramatic increase in candidate spending due to the emphasis on more localized factors in congressional elections. Even presidential candidates ran campaigns that were more regional in nature, as reflected by Nixon's Southern strategy, which represented a significant shift from the politics of old. Indeed, Republicans were generally considered to be more successful at winning the White House in this era, while Democrats largely controlled the U.S. Congress, which necessarily required a level of split-ticket voting previously unseen. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 1990s, we once again witnessed a gradual shift toward more nationalized elections. Congressional candidates running in the 1980s began emphasizing many of the same issues repeated by Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush during their re-election campaigns. As noted at the beginning of the chapter, during the 1994 congressional elections, new technology was employed to digitally morph Democratic candidates' faces into that of President Clinton, who was considerably less popular than he had been when elected 2 years earlier. Although George W. Bush was not on the ballot during the 2006 midterms, Democratic strategists sought to remind voters how closely tied congressional representatives were to him using their party unity scores. A similar strategy was employed by Republicans in the 2010 midterms, given the increasing unpopularity of President Obama, which resulted in Democrats losing control of Congress in that election. The trend continued later in the decade, although in a somewhat different fashion. Members of Congress began to try to distance themselves from their own party's leadership to secure their electoral futures. Many Democratic candidates in the 2018 midterm elections strongly emphasized during their campaigns that their first vote in Congress would be against Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House of Representatives, instead of placing emphasis on more substantive or district-specific matters. Additionally, sitting members in recent years have found creative ways to distance themselves from their party leaders. For example, some incumbent legislators will vote against approval of the House Journal, a constitutionally mandated record of the day's proceedings within the House, which generally does not, or should not, result in a close vote. However, members can use this procedural vote as a mechanism to say they had defied leadership and voted differently from their party. The hope was that by doing so, they had insulated themselves from attacks tying them to national political figures. In each of the elections discussed earlier, increased nationalization played a significant role in the electoral outcomes. Candidates running for re-election often have their electoral fortunes tied directly to a president, especially at a midterm, but that phenomenon has become even more pronounced during the past few decades. Candidates who could once get re-elected by emphasizing local factors like advertising, credit claiming, or constituency service have a much harder time employing such re-election strategies in a more nationalized electoral environment. Under those circumstances, candidates who share a party affiliation with the president are more likely to have their behavior scrutinized in connection with the person currently occupying the White House, for better or for worse. The preceding statements are particularly pertinent when we consider the events leading up to the 2020 presidential election, along with all the elections that would occur simultaneously. Although it is not uncommon for House or Senate candidates to express their support for or opposition to the current occupant of the White House, this was taken to an extreme in 2020. In the congressional primaries, for instance, a significant majority of Republican candidates defined their candidacies through their unconditional support of President Trump and his policies. Even though the president saw a modest increase in approval prior to March 2020, before gradually declining again because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the besieged economy, and significant outrage over racial relations in the United States, many Republicans did not waver in their support of the president. At the same time, Democratic candidates, including presidential nominee and former Vice President Joe Biden, took every opportunity to point out how the sitting president was at the center of many of the problems the country was facing. Thus, it was no exaggeration to say that President Trump overshadowed the 2020 elections in every possible way. In addition to the electoral consequences of Trump's presence in the 2020 elections, the increased level of nationalization also yielded both direct and indirect effects on democratic accountability and representation. When politics was less nationalized, House and Senate candidates could run campaigns independent of the president, unlike elections during the party ballot era. With this new era of nationalization, candidates' electoral fortunes are once again more directly tied to the president, which makes it more difficult for them to get reelected on their own merits. Indeed, some Republican incumbents encouraged voters to not judge their reelection campaigns based on their feelings about President Trump. In an interview with Roll Call, Representative Rodney Davis, Republican, Illinois, said, People who don't like the president, they came out in droves in 2018 by voting against me. Last time we were the only way somebody could voice displeasure with the president. Now they've got an opportunity to, if they don't like him, they can also balance out their votes. The greater linkage between presidential and congressional candidates has direct effects on the ability to hold elected officials individually accountable, since such efforts are now being influenced collectively because of the greater nationalization. With figures like former President Trump looming large in political circles, it becomes difficult for congressional candidates to try to distinguish themselves to their voters, thus directly impacting representation. Since this increased nationalization does not appear to be a function of electoral rules in place, as was once the case, it becomes even more difficult to try to diagnose possible reforms, since much of the effect is likely a function of changes in voter behavior over time. In the remainder of the book, we seek to investigate this phenomenon in greater detail so we can better understand both the underlying causes as well as the consequences of nationalization over much of the history of the United States. Indeed, we believe that many of the changes observed in the electorate during the past few decades is partially a function of how both presidential and congressional candidates have chosen to present themselves in their political campaigns. Scope of the book. We examine a variety of puzzles related to nationalization in the political sphere over time. Specifically, the rest of this work proceeds as follows. In Chapter 2, we review the existing literature on the nationalization of elections. Most of the research on this topic has focused on the recent increase in the nationalization of elections. However, as previously mentioned, we demonstrate that this is not the first time in American political history that nationalization has been so prevalent. The institutions in place during the 19th century necessarily induced high levels of partisan loyalty among those voting. We examine much of this historical literature to place our understanding of nationalization in a broader historical context. In Chapter 3, we compare nationalization between the 19th century and today. Nationalization during the 19th century was an artifact of institutional design, namely the party ballot. During this era, voters necessarily offered greater support for the same party in presidential and sub-national elections, a common measure of nationalization. By contrast, nationalization today is believed to be a function of voter choice based largely on increased levels of polarization. Although the forces that drive nationalization may differ across historical periods, the effects on election outcomes, the incumbency advantage, polarization, and voter behavior vary in predictable ways regardless of the factors producing increased or decreased nationalization. In Chapter 4, we investigate the relationship between nationalization and the electoral connection. Some works suggest that nationalization has the potential to weaken the relationship between constituents and voters, while other research reaches a different conclusion. For example, Carson and Sievert show that it is possible for congressional candidates to establish an electoral connection with voters even during a highly nationalized era of politics. This is largely a result of the various electoral rules in place at the time that differ from those influencing elections today. Congressional elections were often held on different days from the presidential election throughout much of the 19th century, for instance, which suggests that nationalization would not necessarily be an overriding factor in all elections held during this era, unlike modern elections. In Chapter 5, we examine the connection between nationalization and incumbency that was first identified by Jacobson. In his analysis, Jacobson attributes the rise and decline of the incumbency advantage in recent decades to variation in the nationalization of congressional elections. Specifically, he focuses on changes in the association between voters' choices in congressional and presidential election and party loyalty among the electorate. Our findings suggest that incumbents have always enjoyed some electoral advantages, but the magnitude of the incumbency advantage fluctuates in predictable ways over time, with changes in both institutional and political conditions. In Chapter 6, we examine the connection between nationalization and polarization in Congress. This work builds on Hopkins, who argues that though polarization and legislative gridlock have many causes, nationalized political behavior is an underappreciated one. Specifically, we theorize that in periods of low nationalization, a moderate candidate may be able to attract support from voters of the opposite party to win a seat in Congress. As nationalization increases, however, ideological congruity may fail to lead a candidate to victory if she affiliates with the wrong party. By again leveraging immense historical variation, we can offer an alternative explanation for the changing levels of congressional polarization observed during the past 180 years. Next, we evaluate various behavioral factors that can enhance nationalization in the modern era via survey experiments in Chapter 7. Jacobson, for instance, maintains that in recent decades, voters have become more likely to align their voting behavior across presidential and congressional races. This raises an important question that we intend to explore. Are voters making this choice intentionally? Or are they simply responding to the types of nationalized campaigns that candidates are now running, which is more analogous to the conditions present during the 19th century? We seek to address this question more systematically using experimental evidence in this chapter. In Chapter 8, we provide a more in-depth analysis of the current nationalized American political environment. Specifically, we examine the 2020 congressional elections and the 2021 gubernatorial elections and how nationalization shaped these outcomes. We pay special attention to how nationalization shapes candidate endorsements in the modern era, as well as how it complicates electoral accountability. We conclude with a discussion of what to expect in future elections and provide insights on whether this trend will subside or if it represents a new norm in American politics. Finally, in Chapter 7, we summarize our key findings and contributions, further discuss the implications of our work for the future of elections and politics in the United States, and outline ideas for additional research. We believe that our analysis of nationalized politics in both state and congressional elections will help us understand the underlying causes and effects of this important change in American politics. Although down-ticket candidates have always been beholden to those individuals at the top of the ticket, this takes on a very different meaning in an era when ideologically extreme and populist candidates are seeking the highest offices in the land. 2. Nationalized elections, a review. If 20th century electoral politics could be summarized with a single phrase, the political adage, "all politics is local," which is commonly attributed to former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, would be a fitting choice. The often quoted phrase can be understood to mean that a politician's success is directly tied to his ability to understand and influence the issues of his constituents. Personal issues, rather than big and intangible ideas, are often what voters care most about. Whether one looks to the regional and corresponding ideological divisions within both major political parties, or the cultivation of the personal vote among one's constituents, there is ample evidence that local circumstances were crucial to understanding election outcomes in the previous century. During the first few decades of the 21st century, however, American electoral politics have transformed considerably, and the value of local attentiveness has waned. As a result, the idea that all politics are in fact local has been put to the test, as constituents and activists are drowning out local issues and forcing senators and representatives to answer locally for every national controversy. The nationalization of politics is not confined to federal elections. In August 2012,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?